Sejam todos muito bem-vindos ao nosso centro de eventos IMAP Barigui. O Instituto Municipal de Administração Pública tem uma honra muito grande de receber vocês aqui, bem como receber pessoas que nos inspiram e que vão compartilhar de sonhos, de histórias. E a nossa intenção neste encontro, que nós estamos aqui numa parceria, dá para dizer assim, com o Instituto Jaime Lerner, com a presença da Ariadne, vem Ariadne, por favor. Também nós estamos com a presença do nosso palestrante, Charles Landry, okay? E também a presença da Ilana Lerner, venha, e a Ana, do IPUC. Nessa nossa história, a vinda do Charles para cá, ele quis vir a Curitiba, a Ariadne, nossa, fugiu o nome. A Ariadne sugeriu de a gente fazer este encontro para a Ana, do IPUC, e a Ana falou, vamos fazer? Eu falei, para já. Para já, gente. Essa é uma oportunidade muito especial. Eu estou apaixonada por este cidadão que eu conheci hoje, mas eu já vi falas dele na internet. A internet é maravilhosa, não é verdade? Proporciona este conhecimento prévio. Uma pessoa que se dedica às cidades, ao planejamento urbano e que usa da criatividade e do pensamento para projetar o nosso futuro. E nós todos aqui temos gente da prefeitura, de várias áreas da nossa prefeitura, e temos pessoas que não são da prefeitura. Todos muito, muito bem-vindos. Eu vou parar de falar, porque quem tem a palavra hoje é o Charles.
Right, hello. The only reason I'm in Curitiba is to see the capybaras. Just so you know, that's the only reason. And I have seen one this morning, so that's good. So I'm happy. Now, obviously, you've been a reference, you collectively, the city, have been a reference point for many, many places around the world. And I remember spending 3 days with Jaime Lerner in Adelaide, and he was obviously interesting, but he drank a lot of wine, I tell you. But anyway, so I'm going to go a bit like this and a bit like that, you know, whatever, overture, allegro, adagio, you know, a bit like that. So let's try and relax. Now, everybody, as you know, is thinking about, you know, where cities are and where they're going. And what I want to talk a bit about is how we navigate this world of creativity and where it comes from and where we might be going. And there have always obviously been creative places. This is Siena, for example. Accounting and financial mechanisms were invented in Siena, just as one example. So the novelty, or the thing that is new, is really this real understanding. And Patrick Geddes, those who are into planning will know him, 120 years ago, a biologist and a planner, very interesting. And he said, a city is more than a place in space, it's a drama in time. And we know that to be true. The essence of the creative city idea in one sentence is, in times of dramatic change, how do you create the conditions for people, organizations, and the city as a whole to think, plan, and act with imagination? It's a long sentence, sorry, to solve problems and to create opportunities. Now, the novelty, if there is a novelty, is simply that so many places over the last 30, 40 years have self-consciously thought, I want to be a creative city or more imaginative. And the key issue is how do you weave these elements, because the city is a complicated thing, into a mosaic. Now, I've often thought, what is the metaphor if we're talking about music? And I love it, we're in a music place, Brazil, my God. So I'm always thinking, the city is more like jazz improvised jazz than a well-tempered symphony orchestra. And I know that sounds easy, but once you think of jazz and the way someone comes in, they improvise, they know what you're doing, they can feel what you're doing next, and so on. I like the metaphor. So then and now, as we say, you know, there were always places that did something, thought about how to solve problems. Now, I'm going to say something that we all know, but so many of us forget, which is culture is who we are, and creativity helps what we could become or can become. I know I'm a bit sloganistic, but sometimes that can be useful. And the interesting point is, and by the way, graffiti is always useful in telling a story, is culture, that sense of who we are, is often not the operating system in the way cities are working. And I believe that cultural insight and knowledge and understanding is the other invisible hand. There may not be an invisible hand of the market, but this is really what drives things, in my opinion. So, because it's so important, we sometimes forget it, because it's like the air we breathe, it's like our second skin, and so, okay, some people forget it. And it matters because I believe that it helps us make sense, and because we understand where we come from and all that, we make sense of ourselves, it helps us understand. And then I think it also, because we're understanding more, helps us understand what is meaningful because it's significant. So ultimately, of course, identity. Now, creativity, to me at least, matters because it's a sort of form of energy and a life force, but most importantly, I think it's an attitude and an enabler of lots of things. And therefore, this energy is the sort of energy I've always been interested in. How can you unleash that potential in people, organizations, and the city as a whole? I got involved in this from my own personal story simply because I saw so many people, met them, and I thought, they're fantastic, but they're trapped somehow. They're not fulfilling what they could fulfill. The same with organizations. So I've been a bit obsessed by how do you harness that collective intelligence and imagination. So obviously there are qualities of being creative. There are many qualities, but the first one is to be open-minded rather than closed-minded, and to have perhaps a yes if rather than a no because attitude. And that's the slogan of a festival that I set up in Berlin called the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. I know it's an oxymoron, but I think there's something in it, for me at least. And lastly, of course, it's not about always being, yes, oh, hey, it's all cool, I'm creative. It's sometimes being divergent in one's thinking, but then, of course, things need to be implemented and made to happen. So some of the guiding principles initially, I'll come to this in a second, was this interplay between this wider definition of culture, who are we in this bigger sense, and that narrower sense of particular forms of art or something, design and so on, and how they interplay with each other. And the other part of this guiding principles, how does it foster an innovation ecosystem, which of course we know what's happening at the moment, AI, etc., and how those can be ethically framed so we're not really purely controlled. So in that sense, I believe that city making is a cultural project. It's a cultural project because it's about values, attitudes, habits, behavior, what we think is beautiful and ugly, aesthetics, which is why, you know, when I look at Curitiba, it just looks very different from Porto Alegre or Rio de Janeiro, etc., etc., etc. And of course, all of this responds to the geography, the landscape, and so on. The other thing, I suppose I was thinking about is how can you change the way the mind works? And I believe this whole idea of the creative city, in principle, at least, is an empowering ethos, where it says ordinary people can make the extraordinary happen if given a chance. And the bigger story of this idea, if there is a bigger story, is really establishing a culture of creativity. So, you know, like your transport ideas were incredibly imaginative, or whatever, in social affairs, obviously economics and so on. And so I've always been trying to explore the linkages and the differences between social innovation, academic innovation, business, and of course, my latest mini obsession, bureaucratic innovations. So another way of looking at this enabling thing is to say the approach, look, we all know the situation is dreadful. However, I prefer to think through of having a glass half full rather than a glass half empty approach, to say, okay, what is the opportunity in the problem or weakness into strength? So if we then look at cities, and I think here is an audience that of course knows everything about cities, but if one looks at a city from this wider perspective in the mind, I mean, in passing, one of the things we do, I know there's a lot of people, psychiatrists and psychologists in Brazil, is actually psychologizing cities, which is what we've done, is we bring psychotherapists in and treat the city as if it's a person and say, could you actually do what you say you're going to do if you have that mindset? Could it work? Anyway, I find that quite interesting. So we all know that the world is in motion. We know it's in motion in many ways. Too many buildings, perhaps. This is Sao Paulo. And, you know, we know that we need zones of encounter where we feel safe and somehow can get to know each other, and particularly places of empathy. Since we're all in our buildings, how do I know what you're really like, etc., etc. But then I keep on again back to the graffiti thing, seeing graffiti like here, Athens, wasted youth. There were lots of these wasted youth. I can't bear it, it's horrible. What the hell are you talking about? Or when I saw this picture from a long time ago in Glasgow, you can see the problem. But then I saw this, and I thought this was quite interesting. I don't know where this was, but I saw this lift, and I thought, yeah, can you open doors for me? And then the door opened, and there were all these packages. But in a sense, this is only a metaphor to say that unless we're actually solving problems from their perspective, we're not going anywhere. Because when you analyze any city and the dynamics, most cities, I know the ones which suck in like a maelstrom, like a vortex, people, most cities are talented people are often leaving and going elsewhere. So the question is, how do you create a city where they want to come back? So this movement is interesting but also destabilizing to some extent, because then the question remains, where do I belong? Where do we belong when everything is on the move? So that's why I wrote a book called The Civic City in a Nomadic World, just tracking what's going on. And some of it is a bit destabilizing. Here, this guy in a metro station in Berlin, you know, it's got Stockholm, Vienna, Rome on his thing there, and he's going to sleep there. But you get the idea of what I'm talking about. So what is then the sort of plan B in all of this bigger context about where we're going and how we get there? So we're using, or I'm using, all these big words. And the interesting thing about big words, they're very difficult to define. They're so big. I mean, culture, Raymond Williams said, is the most difficult word in the English language, probably also in Portuguese. So we're using all these big words: creative district, wow, cultural quarter, innovation zones, urbanity, resilience, sustainability. And everything we're talking about is all of that, of course. So if we just try and unscramble that and take it apart, what can we see? Now, I think the city is the laboratory for solving the problems of its own making. And I really like that idea, that it is the laboratory of solving the problems of its own making. Now, you all know what I'm going to say. What is a city? It's people. It's it's activities, it's industries, it's hardware, sewage systems, it's software, it's organizational culture, which I think is an incredibly important dimension. It's networks, sometimes separate networks, but ideally there are ones that collaborate and bring things together in some sort of collaboration. And I think then the key issue about cities that seem to work well rather than those that work badly is this element of trust. And I set up, unfortunately it was in Ukraine, a biennale called the Biennale of Trust. So we got people together, you know, in the KGB headquarters, things like that. You know what I'm getting at. But anyway, it's trying to get those connections. But the thing you all know that too much works in silos is this orchestration. How do you orchestrate this thing coming together, different disciplines, different mindsets, different approaches, because the city, of course, is all of those things. Now, if you, again, I'm simplifying, initially this culture creativity network, the nexus, was basically a repertoire. Okay, we think of the arts, we think of a museum, we think of a whatever, an arts facility, all of that. That's fine. But then I think the phase two was really, hey, there's something else going on. There's about innovations, there's connections perhaps between those forms, but the need to rethink again how we do things and so on. The next focus might have been, or is I think, was economic focus. And then I think we've had a phase where people have said, okay, let's stay ahead of the thing by creating our own culture, which is all this participative imperative that we are shaping, making, co-creating this evolving city in some way together. And then, of course, we get the madness and beauty of the tech world, where it's all embracing, all immersive. Where is my phone type thing? Am I on it all the time, every second of the day? But now, I think the focus of all of these energies, these creativities needs to change. And obviously, you know, climate is one dimension. So this question of being alert, waking up, is really important. Now, where it started from my perspective, my beginnings, was really classically this sort of building. This happens to be in Poland. You see a building like that, what do you do with it? How do you put interesting people in? You know the dynamics. Some artists feel it's cool, they make it all nice, and then the accountant and everyone else comes in, and then there's a gentrification process. I don't need to tell you all of that. But the interesting point from a bureaucratic point of view is how do you create incentives and regulations that protect that through time. So anyway, but what I find really interesting is, I was just in Caldera in Porto Alegre. You know, there's one of these places, and then it's all now hip. So the places that were really horrible working conditions are the ones we think are really interesting. But c'est la vie. But all of this started, of course, with so many industries going down in Europe. It was dramatic. To give you an example, over 30 years, Glasgow lost 30 years, 300,000 people, just as an example. Liverpool, 250,000. And the reason why there was a focus on art forms was all the things that you know about, but it also, people suddenly realized there were more people working in them. And when you take the different elements together, what seems small is big. So in Britain, when the government realized that the export of the music industry was bigger than the export of the car industry, they suddenly focused. And so that was perhaps why that was the thing I tended to focus on at the beginning. So you know all the direct and indirect and symbolic impacts, tourism, etc., image, and so on and so on and so on. But there's obviously this bigger story. Now there is a difference in English, or you know wherever I come from, is between cultural planning and planning culturally. If you say cultural planning, you immediately say, oh, I've got to build the museum or something like that. If you say planning culturally, it means I understand what this place is. I understand the resonances. I know who we are and what we might be. And that is a completely different way of looking at things. So I just think words matter. And so this refocusing on creativity that I'm suggesting is how can different forms of knowledge and interest, for example, the art forms, as just one example, how can they play a role in this transformation? So the big issues we know about, this happens to be an exhibition in Canberra in Australia, but is really how do we manage, we're all a bit egotistical, I'm probably very I hope I'm not too egotistical, but anyway, how do I think beyond myself? And this question of beyond myself, I think is really crucial, because you know and we know that we're in the midst of a systemic crisis where a business as usual approach will not get us to where we are. We know that our economic order and way of life is materially expansive, socially divisive, and environmentally hostile. Even though we know that, we are not reacting strongly enough in that. By the way, that crack is the cover of a book of mine, and I'm saying we need to heal that crack. I'll just go back to the crack. That crack. Even when I look at it, it hurts me. But things around us are all obviously fragile, as you know. There is an element of, is this 1 minute before midnight? And this was the World Ocean Marine Conference. And I just thought, just because we're talking about artists, this is beautifully frightening to actually show, hey, this is really urgent. The fish hurt. They're suffering. Or here, our footprint is too large. Or here, again, there are other options in terms from fossil fuels. You could do more about hydrogen and so on. And did you remember those days in COVID? It was dreadful, but the air was cleaner. And of course we now know, Porto Alegre, I saw it, the earth hurts. Anyway, those floods are obviously related to these problems. And we always tend to, I find, I'm constantly hitting a brick wall. I think many of us here are saying the same things, but we're hitting brick walls. So what are the obstacles? And I think we all know the obstacles, and too infrequently we actually spell them out. Vested interests. People, bad ideas. Yeah? A bad idea, I think, is that the market can solve every problem in the world forever. It's a bad idea. Doesn't mean I'm against the energy of a market and all those positive things. And, mindset is an obstacle. So what does one do then in that context? I think this is where this question of courage comes in. The courage to act, and I probably don't act enough. Now, everything I'm saying, you can indeed, I believe, measure. And I'm not going to go into this in detail. But when you look at the city, and what I find so interesting about Curitiba, is that you're thinking, what's the next step? We just spoke to a transport guy. Your BRT is worldwide known. But you're already talking about, well, could we rethink that even again? Now that is creative, not being satisfied with what you've got. So if you were to measure your creativity, and we do this in various cities, you identify what the talent is, the potential, you find out the regulatory system, the politics, you try to bring it together and harness it. But the main thing is actually you have to see it as you walk through the street. Because to me, again, one of these slogans I might use, the city communicates through every fibre of its being. So when you walk through a city, you see, is this a city saying no to me? Is it saying maybe? Is it saying yes? You can feel that just from a sensory perspective. So I think the creative imagination can clarify or challenge the complicated, the complex, that chaotic stuff, and the confused. But even when those things look chaotic, there's often a pattern that we as city makers can guide, because we can see the weak signals, those that we need to push forward and those we need to push away. So this reframing that I'm beginning to talk about is really important. So reframing is obviously, you know, a circular economy is a reframe. It's saying, is a waste, could it be a resource? Is a reframing. There are lots of reframings, and reframings, I think, release power. So just follow me onto this. This was a thing I was involved in called the House of Radical Collaboration. So I'm going to give some examples. Now, I'm not going to talk about examples you know about, you know, what is it called? Porto Digital in Recife, or the things happening in Florianopolis, and the things happening in at 22 in Barcelona. You know all of those. So I just want to show you some examples that are a bit odd. I'm aware that we're talking obviously a lot about tech and stuff like this. So for example, Porto Alegre has Caldera, where 2,000 people come every year, 150 startups, lots of stuff. But they're saying we need to develop the next areas in a more artistic way, because the imagination of engineers is wonderful. However, it would be very good to bring science and all of these things together in new combinations. And that, to me, is the next step. So just a few examples I'll go through. I know you're going to say, the Baltics? Here, there are less people in the Baltics than in bloody Curitiba. But just wait a second, you'll see why. And then elsewhere. So this is just very quickly. So if you're having a city, and these things about innovation and creativity, often clustered, everybody talks about clustered in hubs of various sort. So does then the hub, isn't the question I would always ask, is it being a model for that we want to be, resilient, sustainable, or is it just for itself? Or are the products and services generated there helping make the world better, or both? Now obviously it should be both. Now the dilemmas I find in these innovation processes is how local people can be encouraged, or their skills can be part of that innovation ecosystem. And the other thing is, to what extent we're just thinking of physical structures where you can't really connect, or is it more to do with generating content? And then obviously the balance between where the resources come from. Another question I often ask myself, and what I find quite interesting, you know, I obviously went to the symbol in the botanical gardens, and Ariadne took the photo, and I stood there, all of that, great. But what I like about the icons or non-icons of Curitiba, they're rather soft. You know, that soft capybara, that soft landscape, the park. Whereas, you know, so the question I ask myself, and I've worked a lot for 15 years with Bilbao, is it one icon or 100 small things done well? And I feel Curitiba is more along the lines of 100 small things done well that are ultimately the essence of a big iconic in some sort of way. It's just a question. But anyway, in these regeneration processes, there's always something like this there, but doesn't matter. So this is a crazy place in Berlin. But here is on the river, next to this are lots of buildings, skyscrapery buildings, where it's all happening apparently. Now a squatted group, controlled 400 meters length, and someone like you helped them buy the land, and their business model is completely different. So they've got this, there are kindergartens here, all stuff you don't find in the city centre, lots of stuff. And it's financed by two things at the edge, a hotel at one end, and then a 15-story building on the other. So there's a transfer of profits and so on, that this works, and it's the opposite of all the other things that you can see in the background. But sometimes, you know, Berlin apparently I can say all this because my background is German, so it's all right if I'm criticizing Germany or Berlin, is that this was one of the cool places, whatever cool means. Okay, and then a Swedish fund bought it, and I was there at the opening, and we had lots of champagne, and they restructured all of this, yeah? Now, I'm not saying it should be like what that was, but this was the result, which is completely soulless. Anyway, I'm just making an indirect point. Here's another example. I promise you I'm aware of Florianopolis, blah-de-blah, Campinas, etc., etc. But here in Vilnius, which is a very high, we're now in the Baltics, very high-tech hub place, there is a republic. There was this area which was a bit like a favela, a bit like your favela here, although your favela seems different to the one I was in Rio and Sao Paulo. But anyway, it's a favela. Anyway, this was a favela, and some artists just said, we're going to create a republic, right? So they recreated this republic. The only problem, it's so bloody successful that all the other people are coming in and the prices are going up and so on. But the interesting thing, I'm not showing you this wall of the Constitution in 20 languages. And I'm going to say something completely ridiculous. So in this Constitution, it says, what does it say here? A dog has the right to be a dog. I have the right not to fulfill my obligations and duties. You get the idea. Now, it's only a provocation, but it is quite interesting to rethink. I mean, here, what does it say about the cat? A cat is not obliged to love its owner, but when it should help when in times of need. I know it's mad. It doesn't matter. Because at least it's provoking. And then as you go round, there's this Fluxus artist, you know what they were, movement in the 60s. And then I came to this sign and it started saying, no meaning in life? Try changing your values or workplace or partner. Or just turn off social media. I mean, I know, but actually, it's quite relevant. And then it said here, a lot of times, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Boom, 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 again and again and again and again and again. Anyway, you get the point. Sometimes provocations are good. But I think when one's thinking of regeneration, this is a prison, a really horrible prison. And of course, lots of creatives, tech people have moved in. You can imagine this is a vast building. But what they have done is actually linked it to the horribleness of its past. And all these cells, there are exhibitions that relate to suffering, to injustice, to all sorts of things. So I think that's good when somehow there's a combination, so it's not just one thing. We're in the Baltics now, as you can see. This is one of the biggest startup events in Tallinn, Estonia. So let's just work this out. The highest per capita unicorn place in the world is Estonia. You all know that a unicorn is something that's worth $1 billion. Okay, Skype invented there. TransferWise, now called Wise. Bolt, all come from Estonia. And Estonia has a third or a half the population of Curitiba. So there's something about this place. You know, obviously the threat of Russia helps. You know, crisis can help innovation. But what they are interested in is what it says there, empowering everyone. But there are all these hubs. So this is all industrial stuff. Whether you like this or not, it doesn't matter. But they're taking the risk. Here, you know, they're bringing in that sort of stuff. This is an area which was a submarine factory, which is, you know, I mean, these are just buildings. But on the other hand, they're quite interesting. Or here, the Sauna Pod Hotel, you know, also quite weird. And whatever, an experience centre for children. I mean, you've done all this. But the latest one is called Krulli, and that's why I was there. Krulli, I like the name, Krulli. Franz Krulli was, whatever, he was an industrialist. So this is going to be a vast area which combines the sort of slightly imaginative stuff, because the guy who's funding it is the guy who sold TransferWise, and new innovations at the same time. So really my main message is this combination. And it was interesting, you know, they're prefiguring what's happening. This is one of the buildings, and had an exhibition about Mariupol, you know, that factory in the Ukraine where all these people defended. And I couldn't take a picture of the person who was the picture. There was a man with a dog. Of course, he died, and this is his mobile phone. But again, it's this combination of things that are important and really matter, social justice and things like that, with that drive of economics and so on. The last example I'll give is one that I think is quite relevant. Nantes in France is the fastest growing metropolis in France. And the reason is it created on Ile-de-France an island long, 10 kilometers long, 3 kilometers wide. It had all these institutions that you can imagine, you know, whatever, design colleges, media campus, and so on. But also these high-thinking biology-type institutions on the same thing. Now, the question they're asking themselves, which is the problem here, they are all isolated. Now, clearly, those biologists should be connecting with these other people as well. The only reason I'm showing you this elephant, because it's very famous, you probably know about it. When it moves around in another city, you get about 1 million people following the elephant. In London, there were 1 million people who followed it. So it's done things that are quite interesting. This is the design college. Anyway, whatever. So, but it also has one of the most powerful museums, because this is where the French slave trade went from. 1,800 ships went from this port, just where those things I was showing you are. And these are the names of these ports. And again, I just like the idea of playfulness, seriousness, innovation, imagination, bringing these things together. And these are just various speeches by people. This is where the boats left from. Now, of course, one could have talked about, you know, Bogota, Bronx, which you know about. Here the question is, what happens to those guys there when you revitalize it and so on? So, where next and how? And what's best? Now, this is a We Make the City event in Amsterdam, and it has all the words that we probably find quite interesting. You know, we want a circular economy, we want to be seriously smart, we want a city for all of us. And I think that is really interesting to me. And I was able to do an exhibition in Sicily, and you should look this up. Not crazy, he's not at all crazy, he's a lawyer who revitalized a place called Favara by buying up the buildings and having a biennale of cities. And when I first went there, I said, Dove Favara? I didn't know where the hell it was. It's near Agrigento. And so this tiny place where he, as a lawyer, just bought a notary, bought up the buildings, led to something that has had a powerful impact. So you should look it up. But what that reminded me of is there is this yearning. I know it's not the same quite as saudade, but it's quite similar. This, I think there's a yearning for something, which certainly in the conversations I have, that one can do things differently, that there could be a different story of the place we want to be and how we get there, where we then say to all of us as a group, what are we bringing? And in this exhibition, all around the city, there were these posters everywhere. Can you change a city? Is there an ideal city? Is it inspiring? Is it listening? Are you a city maker? Are you involved? Is it going up or down? And then people wrote all these things on it. Now the point is, this thing about the city as a communications device, you may be revisioning what you do, but I think somehow using the city itself rather than it's somewhere in a building, and if you know the building, you get in there, is quite interesting. So all I would say, that's my main message of that. Now I've got two more things to say. I suddenly realized that metaphors matter. And if we think of the city making like a gardener, there are just so many things that come together. it's exactly the attributes we need for a city, because a garden is about a greenhouse, it's about growing, and the word growing is more than just economically growing, it's personally growing in other ways, and it has so many dimensions. It reminds us that a city is not a machine, it's an organism. It is regenerative and holistic thinking when you're gardening. It conditions how you think, plan, and act. So what is going on in a garden? If you observe closely, a gardener really is looking at the resources, the assets, what I'm calling culture and all of that sort of stuff, very closely. What's the soil? Well, you, of course, you've been telling me about this all yesterday, Ariadna. So this is a garden, it happens to be mine. I live in the middle of nowhere and talk about cities all the time, ridiculous. Nevertheless, when you look closely, you have to say, what's actually happening? Am I looking at the shade and the dark? Should this grow? Should this be big? Should this be small? What about the colours? All of that. And then I'm going even closer. What's exactly happening there? Will this plant grow at this season or not? Is this for winter or summer? Can I work that out? I've got a lot of work to do to make that happen. And that gardening, I think, is a beautiful metaphor for city making. Because what's going on is a 360-degree perspective. It's short, medium, long-term thinking. It's about curation and orchestration of all the elements in those living things that we see. It's thinking in seasons. It's about recycling. And it's getting your hands dirty. City makers get their hands dirty. It's so bloody difficult. And it requires continual maintenance, care, patience, and passion. And there's a lot of waiting. I keep on thinking in gardening, you wait all the time. It's just like a planning approval. It's going on forever. It's frustrating. It takes a long time. You had the idea for 7 years and it's still not happening. And sometimes nature does its own thing. It's suddenly a bird drops something and then an oak tree grows. That's the same with cities. So the gardening metaphor is a bit like being a caretaker. You could also think of a mycelium, the biggest plant in the world. So I'm just saying nature metaphors are really interesting in thinking about cities. So the mycelium is the biggest living organism in the world. You've probably read Merlin Sheldrake's book, Entangled Life. It's vast, but the thing about mycelia is they help each other. It's a generous network. Each thing finds nutrition for the next. It's all the things we think are good about cities. I help you if you help me. We're part of the same thing. There's an information system. There's a connective software. It's hardware and software together. I mean, you may think I'm completely mad, but nevertheless, I think it's a useful metaphor because it has these endless parallels about incubating variety, a nursery, a hothouse, an oasis. So finally, what makes this livable city? I mean, you know what makes a livable city because you spent the last 40 years creating one. So this is the image I was saying about this dilemma earlier. This is Zurich West. They have a hotel called the Renaissance Hotel. All the companies that have moved in are all the cool companies, One artist says, you're not going to take my building down, puts the word resistance in the same typeface. So this is the central problem to me of making great places, because the moment you make great places, unless you bend the market, you get the process where people have to move out. So of course it's easier to imagine the fall of the world than to remake it, but I think what I really love about Curitiba and what you've done for the last 50 years is this continually thinking afresh. So here I end with what makes, these are all the words we like, great, livable, creative, resilient, culturally vibrant places. What are they? They are to me places of anchorage. I'm here, but distinctiveness. This could only be Curitiba. This is not Florianopolis. This is not Fortaleza. So what that is will differ. This is India, Jodhpur, the blue city. This is Fez, Morocco. It doesn't matter. You know what your distinctiveness is. This is Istanbul. Second, great, livable, etc., places are places of blending the old and the new and not forgetting. This endless forgetting what seemed to work well. You know, the way we knew that multiple uses in a building was very useful. And here, this is Copenhagen. This is all one of these old structures where they bring people together. The third element is nourishment and nurture. So again, I don't know what your food strategy is, but food, where is it grown, how is it grown, blah, 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 all of that. Do I need an avocado when it comes from 5,000 kilometers away, etc. But of course it's about nurture, nourishment, care. Parks is really also nurture and nourishment, the feeling to be in nature. But they're also affordability and access. And here you have to say that Singapore is absolutely brilliant at finding affordability of housing through the different ranges worth looking at. Then, of course, places where you can communicate and connect, whether that's through the physical structures like here in Paris or here in Chicago, Millennium Park. When you're in that cloud gate, I saw more people sort of talking to each other, looking at each other, saying, oh yeah, why am I gone? You get the idea. And even a small word. Because what is community? Often community is a thousand small little exchanges, some of which then might become more important. But it starts with, often, I think, with little elements. So then, I think it's also critical thinking and reflection. This is where I admire your city so much. Just really, this happens to be an exhibition, but it's just, we often don't leave ourselves that time to reflect. And of course, diversity in all its senses, in the biggest sense of diversity. Be as you are, let me have your views, I know you think differently, and so on. And then, opportunity, of course. I want to feel that I can go somewhere and something happens here and I can be more than I thought I was at the beginning, and so on. And then, I said it already before, the big issues that really matter. Many of you will know these mini icebergs brought from Greenland. Olafur Eliasson was in Paris, Copenhagen, and so on. The melting ice. And when you touch that ice that is melting, you sort of don't need a long story, which is the difference between iconic communication. You understand it immediately. You work out the narrative later. If we're a bit more policy people, we sort of say a narrative, but it should perhaps be both. And then, of course, aspiration is part of that thing. And this is one of the best places for me. This is in a Helsinki bus station. And this is called the Chapel of Silence. I don't know what silence feels like for Brazilians, but silence. Just feel your way through. When you go in there are just a few benches, very big finished stones, and you just calm down. And that is an interesting link between the church and social services. Next time you're in Helsinki, I know it's cold, don't worry. Go in there. And here's another example in Cape Town. This is the place where all the blacks were pushed out. And in a Baptist church, they painted the streets. And the people who lived there put their name on the street. So you can imagine that you sort of are very tearful when you go in there. So that again, it's this, I don't know what it is it aspiration, but it's certainly inspiration. And then I think, I've been a bit heavy, I'm sorry, but I do think city making is about fun as well. And Banksy is wonderful. Now, he subverted the social museum in, the city museum in Bristol. Bristol has 250,000 inhabitants. He took 100 objects, including the lion, so the lion has eaten the tamer, and 400,000 people went to the thing, which is more than the total yearly 2-year visitation of that museum. So thinking laterally can sometimes do things well. Here's another example, is criticizing consumption. So I think serious fun is also useful. And finally, obviously, we need to be digitally aware in some way, not let the algorithm control us. We know there are lots of potentials in AI, but let's make sure perhaps we're in charge. And then, finally, more or less, bending the market to bigger picture purposes, having the energy of the market but shaping it and guiding it. So it's not always about money. It's about more than that. And then good governance, of course, and imagination. And this is our festival, Creative Bureaucracy Festival. I don't want to publicize myself, but nevertheless, it's about rethinking regulations and rules so that they work well. And I believe it's a movement in the making. So a conclusion, less what is the value of culture and creativity, but what is the cost of not valuing them. Thank you very much. Be best not in, but for the world.